What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we have the 5th episode in our player breakdown series. We'll be taking a look at the draft decision between Ezekiel Elliott, David Montgomery, and Josh Jacobs. This was your most requested running back breakdown this week, and next week we'll be hopping back on over to wide receiver, taking a look at Pittman versus Mike Williams versus Deontay Johnson. So, how are we ranking these players? Let's start off by comparing their production over the last 3 seasons. Jacobs and Montgomery were rookies 3 years ago, so we should kind of keep that in mind when looking at their first season. So since 2019, their average half PPR points per game has been 14.81 for Zeke, 13.85 for Jacobs, 12.97 for Montgomery. However, that is heavily weighted by a 2019 season where Zeke averaged 19 points per game. Since 2019, he's dropped down to 13.18 points per game and then 13.45 points per game last season. If we take a look at just the last 2 seasons, the points per game breakdown changes. It's 14.66 for Montgomery, 13.79 for Jacobs, 13.31 for Zeke, with Montgomery finishing first among this group in each of the last 2 years. So my first question when looking at that is, did any of them get lucky? And honestly, the answer is no. A lot of times we look at players at the end of the season and they got very unlucky with like deep passes, or they got unlucky with touchdowns, got way more volume, or maybe they got super lucky with touchdowns. They didn't get that many carries and they scored a ton. The answer is really no for any of these three. Over the last 3 seasons, all of these backs have combined for 7 receiving touchdowns with a maximum of 2. So one of them didn't all of a sudden get like 5 receiving touchdowns on like 30 receptions, something that's probably not going to repeat. So that's not something that should regress. And none of them are so involved in the receiving game and so involved in the red zone that they should have seen a ton more touchdowns. So on average, they produce pretty much what they should have in the receiving game. And the player with zero touchdowns so far is Jacobs, but he's the least involved in the receiving game, especially when they get close. And so it makes sense. In terms of rushing touchdowns, none of these guys have gotten crazy lucky or unlucky there either. All 3 have been between 6 and 12 touchdowns in each of the last 3 seasons, and all have had pretty standard touchdown luck when you look at their carries inside the 10-yard line. You could argue that perhaps David Montgomery fell on the low end. He's scored on 24% of his carries inside the 10-yard line compared to 29% for Zeke, 28.5% for Jacobs. But I'd counter that by saying, well, Montgomery's on the worst team. And he was the entire offense for a good chunk of the last 3 seasons. Whereas, there are other players on the Cowboys and other players on the Raiders that defenses have had to account for. So overall, maybe Montgomery could have scored a touchdown or 2 more over the sample on average, but I think their historical production is a pretty reliable thing to look at when comparing these players. So the next question you think about is, will that change? So we can look back and say that historical production makes a lot of sense. That's a really, really good indicator of the value that they were providing. But we don't care about that. When I'm drafting Dave Montgomery, Zeke, Jacobs, I don't care what they did the last few seasons. I care how that production could change moving forward. Has anything happened over, the offseason that could impact any of these players? The biggest change is obviously Devonta Adams joining the Raiders. This is going to have 2 really big impacts in my eyes. First, the red zone usage should drop. Adams is a monster in the red zone, not only because he can dominate in one-on-one coverage, but because teams know that he can do that, right? Defenses know he can do that, and so they need to shift coverage over to him. So the Raiders are going to have plenty of situations where either they're able to successfully isolate Adams, and you obviously go to him when he's isolated in one-on-one coverage, or he's not isolated, defenses shift a lot of coverage to him, and then we get dream matchups with Darren Waller, with Hunter Renfrow, because teams are trying to take away Adams, and it leaves a lot of other stuff open. In my eyes, that's going to increase the red zone passing touchdown percentage of the Raiders. I think that they are going to throw the ball a lot more when they get close, score more touchdowns through the air. They've been middle of the pack the last 3 seasons. I would expect them to enter the top 10 this season. That's obviously a negative for Jacobs. On the flip side, though, I would expect them to score more points overall. Adams is just going to make the offense better, convert at a higher rate, get to the red zone more. And so even if they throw at a higher rate, a smaller piece of a larger pie might end up being the same amount of pie for Jacobs. So overall, I would say the touchdown expectation for Jacobs probably shouldn't be impacted by bringing Adams over. In terms of non-touchdown differences, the trade's likely going to help. Jacobs is one of those running backs that everybody knows is supremely game script dependent. He goes off when they're winning and he duds when they're losing. Since his rookie season, 18.2 half PPR points per game in their 21 wins, 9.7 half PPR points per game in their 22 losses. Not great, especially in the best division in football. You can also break apart those losses into duds and close games. Over the last 3 years, the Raiders have lost by more than a score and scored less than 20 points 11 times, half of their losses. In those 11 games, Jacobs has averaged 7.1 half PPR points per game. In the other 11 losses, so when they lose by either less than a touchdown or they at least just score 20 or more points, well, Jacobs now averages 12.3 fantasy points per game. So as you can see, it's a little bit more complex than Raiders lost, Jacobs did bad. On average, you can say that, but if it's a big loss, they didn't score many points, he does terrible. If they're at least scoring some touchdowns or the game is at least somewhat close, he's not actually performing that poorly. So to me, the Adams signing is a net positive. He's absolutely going to give them a better chance at winning football games, a better chance of scoring 24 points even in losses, and that's going to be a good thing for Jacobs, keeping them more competitive in games. So even if they are in the most difficult division, at least if they're staying competitive in the division, it's going to be a positive. The bigger concern is probably Zamir White. He is a player that has a ton of upside, someone I'm very excited about. Now, he didn't go super early in the draft, and Jacobs is still a fantastic running back, so White's not just going to step in and take over right away. I really just don't think that's in the cards. But he does add a bit of unknown and elevates the risk that we don't see consistent, 17, 18 carry games from Jacobs. So while the receptions probably don't change all that much because White's not known as like a pass catching specialist, if he's losing some of the work on the ground, if he loses some of this goal line, that's something we haven't really seen thus far in his career for Jacobs, losing any of that production. And if it happens, it's just something that could negatively impact him that maybe we haven't seen before, because it's not like Kenyon Drake went anywhere also. So if they have 3 running backs, there's at least a chance that we see some of this production come down. As far as changes for the Cowboys and the Bears go, nothing really stands out that's going to move the needle in either direction. I think things have happened for both teams, positive and negative, to where their situations are, fairly similar. Both teams lost playmakers, but I don't expect the Bears to be any worse. I actually expect them to improve post Matt Nagy. And so since they also added no running back competition, I don't think Montgomery is in like a worse spot than he has been in previous seasons. If the team overall does improve, which it seems like they're going to, if Fields has a better season, it's not really going to matter all that much that they did end up losing Allen Robinson, have worse skill players now. So I just think net neutral. They didn't bring in any running backs that are going to compete. Maybe they give Khalil Herbert a little bit more work, but overall, pretty much just view Montgomery exactly how you have been in previous seasons. He's a focal point of the offense, and an offense that I think will improve, but one that's still not going to be all that good. For Dallas, they might take a small step back after losing Amari Cooper, but this is still a great offense, and their backfield is unchanged. So I'm not really concerned about that difference. The only concern you would have is Zeke's declining play, right? He's just been performing worse and worse in recent years, and the fact that Tony Pollard is just better than him. But even though both those things are true, Jerry Jones doesn't care. And I'm not saying that to try and be funny. He genuinely just doesn't care. Zeke is going to maintain the lead in this backfield this season, and his workload will be secure even if Tony Pollard continues to outplay him. That is just the reality of the situation. So let's bundle all that information up and try to make a decision on how to rank these players. What I usually do for these breakdowns is I go in with a projection for each player. Obviously, I have a projection on every single player on the website, but then I do the deep dive and then I look back at the projections and see what adjustments can be made. For this one, I felt, pretty spot on with the Jacobs projection, making him last in this group. The carries are there and the touchdowns are going to help, but I don't trust the receptions with Adams now in town, and I wasn't able to boost the carries enough to really compete with Montgomery and Zeke with Zamir White now in the picture. The only real chance he had at outperforming them in fantasy and half PPR scoring, and we'll actually get to the end why the ranking is the same no matter what the scoring format is, but he wasn't really able to compete with them because I had to give him so many carries to overtake them, and there's no way I could do that because I do believe in the talent of White, and so he just has to be last. He has to be last in the rankings. I couldn't think of anything else to give him that would boost him ahead. So keeping him third in the rankings. I did, however, change David Montgomery. I was being a little bit overly optimistic on his touchdown totals, so I bumped him down to a 53% share of the offensive touchdowns for rushing, obviously, giving him 9.5 on the year. I was also a little bit too high on his receiving touchdowns. He has 3 in his career, and I was projecting him for nearly 3 just this season, so I dropped that down to 1.7. Those moves were enough to drop him to second behind Ezekiel Elliott. I contemplated reducing Zeke's efficiency or giving him fewer carries, but it really came down to 2 things for me. One, I mentioned before, Dallas doesn't care if Pollard is better. Zeke is getting his touches, and so he's getting his touches, he's getting his touchdowns. I just can't see a scenario where tanking those is the correct choice. I know they're going to come, and so it doesn't really matter how good he was. Second, on the efficiency, I know he played poorly last season, but honestly, I basically made him just as efficient as he was last year, maybe a slight boost because he was obviously hurt, and if he's not playing through an injury for the entire season, he's going to be more efficient. And even then, even playing hurt last year, he was still more efficient than David Montgomery since the Cowboys are infinitely better on offense than the Bears. And like I said, the Bears could be better this season, but they're not going to be better than Dallas. You know that for a fact. And so I just couldn't see tanking efficiency on Zeke and boosting it on Montgomery. There's nothing that indicates that I should be doing that. If anything, we should be kind of increasing the efficiency that Zeke saw last season because, again, he was obviously hurt. So again, while I think the Bears are going to take a step forward this season and improve, they're not going to improve enough to rival Dallas. And if I'm expecting, pretty similar overall volume between these two backs, give me the one that is on the better offense, especially when the team has proven to be extremely committed to that running back. So my final ranking of the trio, Zeke first, Dave Montgomery second, Josh Jacobs third. And like I alluded to before, that is the same under every single scoring format. If you take those projections and you do them out for standard, half PPR, full PPR, the exact same rankings remain true. So that'll do it for this week's breakdown. I'll be back tomorrow with players with the highest upside, then Saturday to go over the biggest ADP risers and fallers over the last week. If you're curious about my projection for every single player, you can always check that out at my website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. I have rankings for every scoring format and every league size. So make sure to check that out because no other site is bringing it down that much. That, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.